Originally, the deck I was going to present for Coram the Undertaker was going to be slightly memeish, focusing mostly on references to the professional wrestler The Undertaker. It was going to be based around fight cards and have lots of cool skibbity memes, but then I started building the deck, and the deck was kind of good, despite the intention behind it being kind of a joke. So I powered up the deck some and retooled it with different dynamics, and it was still really good. By the time I was done, I was a bit more interested in some of the newer mechanics than the original meme aspects of the deck. I hopped back into Scryfall and rebuilt the deck again. I repeated that process about 2 more times, ending up with 4 very good Coram decks that were all distinctly different. In this video, I will present the deck that I ultimately ended up on, but how is it possible that Coram can support such a wide variety of archetypes? Coram the Undertaker is a 4-mana value Jund commander, that's 0/5. It gets +X+0, where X is the greatest power among creature cards in all graveyards, and whenever it attacks, each player mills a card. And during each of your turns, you may play a land and cast a spell from among those cards that were put into the graveyard from libraries this turn. Coram is good at punching, but with only 5 toughness, it wouldn't have been super good at fighting. And the deck won through using Toralf to turn your punches into what I call uppercuts, which is they deal power to your opponents instead of the creatures. That ultimately led me to running a lot of tutors, and that became boring. However, the next iterations were focused more on reanimation, since you were already putting large creatures into your graveyard for Coram. But those versions just ended up being reanimation decks that didn't really need Coram. Coram just ended up being there as some extra card value and a big body. The penultimate build was focused on a lot of equipment and buffing auras. That way you can use Coram's power in the red zone and try to win through commander damage. And again, they all worked, and Coram was more or less important in each of the decks. So in this final deck, it's a combination of all those decks. It's way more resilient than the others because it is diverse. I prefer to play decks that are more skill intensive than linear, meaning I like to have a lot of options in what to do instead of just having one path that the deck will naturally take on its own. Now the good part of this for you is that at the end of each section of cards, I'm adding some cut cards from the other versions of the decks. That'll let me go over the cards that didn't quite make the cut for this deck, but are still totally usable. As always, the final deck list will be in the description below, and it will include all the cut list cards in the Considering section. All roads with Coram lead to needing big power in the graveyard, and I run a package of 10 big strong boys, meant to be put in the bin, either through milling or directly put there. Lord of Extinction and Malignus, I think is how you say it, both have the potential to be giant, and I'm talking like 2020 levels of giant. The variable power and toughness on these creatures are active in the graveyard. That's specifically from Rule 604.3, which roughly states that characteristic defining abilities, they work in all zones, including the graveyard, which means Lord of Extinction will get his buff in the graveyard when everyone else is getting milled, which will definitely happen. Stick around until the mill section for more info on what I run there, and when you do run mill, Lord of Extinction will buff Coram very high and very quickly. Same with Malignus. The earlier the stage of the game, the bigger Malignus will be. As long as one opponent has their starting life total, Coram will be at 20 power. Phyrexian Dreadnought and Death Shadow won't really ever see play because they'll most likely just kill themselves when they enter the battlefield. That can be an advantage because they'll put themselves into the graveyard and won't require any further work to get Coram swole. I will point out that Dreadnought costs, I think like over $100 at this point, so feel free to use the official Element Hobbies honorary Magic 30th edition non-tournament legal version shown here. Titanoth Rex will also put itself into the bin, but through cycling instead of horrific self-mutilation. It's also probably right on the edge of being castable in case things are going real bad for you and you just need to get something onto the battlefield. Speaking of castable, Yargle and Multani and Ghalta Primal Hunger are both able to get into the battlefield if you just need another big body. Ghalta is basically free if you have another big creature powering up Coram. Last but not least is Impervious Great Worm, Hierophant Biotitan, and Ancient Stone Idol. These are kind of just flex spots. You can run whatever you want as long as it's big and girthy. Apex Devastator will be a popular choice, I think, but it has 2 things going against it. The first being, in this build of the deck, I don't think the Uber Cascade effect will really do a ton for you. And number 2, I don't own it and I don't want to spend $25 for it. Ghoul Tree is nice if you want to be able to cast it, though being only a 10/10 is kind of on the low end for what I would want to run in this deck. Multani Morrow Sorcerer seems way too swingy for my taste. I guess it depends on the decks you're up against, but I would prefer something a bit more reliable. The fact that the table can try to empty their hand in response to you using Coram's power is kind of a non-starter for me. Primeval Protector is also easily cast, but you won't really get any benefit from the +1/+1 counters, since you don't have a ton of creatures out at any given time. That makes it a plain 10/10, and that's not super great. I also don't run any Eldrazi because I find Eldrazi boring. Sorry. I run 10 cards that will get my big fatties from my hand into the graveyard, and they are a mix of discard and tutoring directly into the bin. Entomb, the gold standard of direct-to-graveyard tutoring. All the other graveyard tutors will do some variation on this. Those other tutors being Final Parting, Unmarked Grave, Vile Entomber, and Buried Alive. We then move on to the discard cards because sometimes you will draw your big boys and you can't do jack with them in your hand. Collector's Vault and Key to the City will both let you put a big boy into the yard, with the benefit of either getting a card and a treasure, or making your Coram unblockable. I then run 3 enchantments in Mortophobia, Tortured Existence, and Survival of the Fittest. We're going to be milling the entire table, and that can be a problem if you're playing against any decks that want stuff in their graveyard. Mortophobia will give you a way to remove problematic graveyard cards that you have accidentally put into your opponent's graveyards. Tortured Existence will let you swap a creature in hand for a creature in your graveyard. The idea here is that you put a fatty into the graveyard in exchange for something you want in play, like a mana dork or something that will mill some cards. Survival of the Fittest will let you bin a creature to tutor for a creature. Similar idea to Tortured Existence. Oh, this also costs way more than it's worth, so you again have my permission to use the official Element Hobbies Honorary Magic 30th Edition non-tournament legal version. Auric Loremaster is potentially powerful, but you really only need 1 giant card in your graveyard, so the fact that it's repeatable isn't super useful to me. I'm also not super thrilled about investing all the mana into a creature that has to survive a full round before you get the desired effect. There's also an entire red line of cards that will discard for draw, and those are all perfectly fine if you prefer spells to artifacts, but I like the repeatable effects that artifacts give you. Since we have these giants in the graveyard, we may as well run a few cards that will let you reanimate them into play. Just make sure you don't target the giants that will immediately die when they do come into play. I only run 2, mostly for a bit of surprise factor, and they are Persist and Stitch Together. They're both cheap reanimation. Stitch Together, you may have to wait a bit until you get Threshold, but if you're having trouble getting Threshold in this deck, then you have larger problems. There are a lot of reanimation cards in Magic and Jund specifically. Rise of the Witch King is a newer reanimation that I kind of like for a bit of creature control, though it is really bad versus token strategies. I like Soul Exchange because I like cheap spells. Bonus points if you ever actually sacrifice a Thrall to this. If you want to go over the top, Virtue of Persistence will let you reanimate from any graveyard over and over again. I'm always leery of 7 mana value cards that don't really do anything until a turn after they come into play, but this card is really powerful. Diabolic Servitude was the closest to make the deck since it's kind of its own recurring reanimation, but I think I would rather just go for Necromancy or Dance of the Dead or Animate Dead if I wanted another reanimate spell that didn't require you to sacrifice Thralls. Now it's time to punch stuff. Might I suggest the like button on this video? Let's start with Legolas's quick reflexes and hard-hitting question. Look at these two, look how juiced some of these Lord of the Rings cards are. They both cost 1 green mana, right? But the Lord of the Rings card is an instant, has split second, will untap the creature and give it hexproof and reach, while hard-hitting question is sorcery speed, and the only bonus it gets is that it can punch planeswalkers. And I actually don't think hard-hitting question is that bad, I mean, look at the disparity in this stuff. Nature's Way will give your creature vigilance and trample in addition to the punch. A real good turn is having a 16/5 Coram punch a creature, and then swing for 16 with vigilance and trample. Ram Through can deal a lot of uppercut damage if the creature has trample, and we do have a few cards that will grant trample a bit later on, so just know that Ram Through will trigger the player damage more often than you think. The last punch card is Windswept Slice, which is another juiced Lord of the Rings card. Making 1/1 elves doesn't really matter in this deck, you don't really have anything in particular to do with them. But 3 mana for a 16 damage punch, and 10 free 1/1s is just too good of a rate to pass up. Halana Kessig Ranger is nice if you want a repeatable punch, but I don't find myself casting too many creatures that I want to punch with, though this was much better in the reanimation-heavy version of this deck where you could trigger the ability after you reanimate a creature. Contest of Claws will get you a big Discover, though similar to Apex Devastator, I don't know that it will really do a ton in this deck, since most of the power of this deck is in the commander, or in the stuff that will most likely cost more than your Discover. Finishing Move and Outmuscle were in the early versions of this deck. Yes, they were kind of just tied to that meme aspect for the whole wrestling thing, and yes, that is good enough reason to run them in your deck if you want. Memes are very powerful. I run 4 uppercuts starting with Burning Anger, which will let you uppercut each turn or sometimes more if you do happen to have Legolas's quick reflexes. Soul's Fire lets you do your fighting damage to anything, but let's be honest, it's going face. Terror of the Peaks is really good. You'll need a few Coram Enter the Battlefield triggers with Terror to completely wipe someone out. Toruf, God of Fury, doesn't directly uppercut people, but it does turn all your fights into uppercuts. He's a trainer of some sort, like Mickey from the Rocky movies, or like Rocky from the Creed movies. Thud and Fling were really good in the reanimation-heavy version of the deck, but not so great here as you rely on Coram being in play. Rakdos Joins Up was nice because it had some reanimation built in, and whenever Coram died, say to something like a Fling, you could get a lot of damage dealt. I would say this is a must for the reanimation version of this deck, but not necessarily needed here. Morgue Burst was nice in testing, but 6 mana for a bunch of damage, I think you can get better for less mana. I think. Same with Sure Strike Titan. 6 mana before anything happens is a lot to invest. Flesh/Blood is probably the card I would add to this deck if I had to. The Blood side is really nice, since 2 mana to throw your power at a player is just 1 more mana than a Thud, but you don't need to lose your creature for it. I run a small package of equipment to give Coram a few abilities that are handy. I wanted to specifically prioritize First Strike and Trample. First Strike because Coram doesn't have the hugest butt, and Trample because Coram has, respectfully, very large fronts. Hexgold Halberd will come attached to a creature, so I think the total mana investment of 5 to get First Strike and Trample on Coram is fine. Helm of Caldera is the same, 5 mana for First Strike, Trample, but you get Haste. That's even better. Chariot of Victory is 4 mana total for First Strike, Trample, and Haste. The only alternatives I really considered were the Incarnations, Anger, Brawn, and Filth, just to get some combat abilities and a hard to get rid of spot. You could really run any equipment you prefer. If you think other abilities are better than I do, go for them, and you can always use Lightning Greaves or Swiftfoot Boots, and they're great. Have fun with it. There are actually a lot of fun wipes that would fit into the theme of the deck, but due to slot constraints, I'm limiting them to 4. Chandra's Ignition is a no-brainer and will probably be the best wipe for all iterations of the Coram deck. Show-Stopping Surprise is not quite as good, but it's still fun and on theme with the whole Coram abilities. I then pivot to some utility wipes in Fade from History and Structural Assault. These are the 2 wipe slots where I think you can mess around and customize them to your meta. Jund has great wipe options, including the new Final Act, which feels like a poor man's Austere Command and an even poorer man's Farewell. Mandate of Abaddon is a good alternative to Show-Stopping Surprise, where it just flat out destroys the punier creatures instead of dealing damage. That can be relevant against certain strategies. I really wanted to run Too Greedily Too Deep, but 7 mana is a lot. I really wanted to run Disaster Radius, which is probably even better than Too Greedily Too Deep. This unfortunately also has a mana value of 7, but this also requires you to hold a giant in your hand. I generally want to be kind of aggressive in getting giants into the graveyard and don't want to worry about keeping one in my hand. 3 Visits, Nature's Lore, and Farseek are the holy trinity of spell-based land ramp. 2 mana value, gets dual lands, and the lands come into play untapped. If you're playing green, you really need a good reason not to be running these. Oh, by the way, I use these all the time and in Board of Them is a very good reason. I then run the 3 appropriate guild signets, Rakdos, Gruul, and Golgari. For a bit more artifact ramp, I run Felwar Stone and Talisman of Resilience. I don't run the other talismans that have red in them because there is generally a pretty low amount of red mana required in this deck. But I don't think a different talisman versus a Felwar Stone is going to make or break the deck, so if you want to run one of the other talismans, go for it. I like to run Spicy Ramp because just running good ramp all the time gets kind of boring. I'm all about card diversity here, and to that end I finish up with a couple of peculiar cards. Undergrowth Recon will let you get back a bunch of your milled cards. Be careful, Coram will only let you play lands for your normal land drop, and only if it was milled that turn. Undergrowth Recon gives you a bit of slow ramp over a long time frame, which I think makes it worth running here. Intrepid Paleontologist. Now if you've seen my Muldrotha Garuda video, you know I love me some 2 mana value ramp creatures. This will give us some additional graveyard control so we don't have to rely on just Mortophobia. You can also get a cheeky extra Galta from its last ability, though that's just really a bonus, it's not super reliable. It is entirely reasonable to add more giants that are dinosaurs to get more value here, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. Armored Scrapgorger is my personal first choice for an alternative, as it's very similar to Intrepid Paleontologist. Tap to exile a card from a graveyard and potentially end up as a 3/3, which is really neither here nor there. Ignoble Hierarch is always in consideration for Jund decks, and I could see the Exalted actually helping out with Coram attacks. And of course, there are many number of green ramp spells as well as more artifact, so I don't think I really need to go into that, but feel free to use what you want. I only run 6 sculpting cards since you're going to get card advantage with Coram, so you don't really need a ton of sculpting cards in the actual deck. The 6 sculpting cards are all essentially mulch, including mulch, but also Satyr Wayfinder, Grizzly Salvage, Scout the Borders, Winding Way, and Discerning Taste, which is my personal favorite since you can bin a big boy and just gain a buttload of life, which is just kind of funny. These will all make sure that you hit your land drops while filling your graveyard with big boys. Remember that casting these with Coram out will mean that you can cast one of the milled cards from these that turn, so that's even a bit more card advantage. If you want to go all in, you can run Hermit Druid, though this deck doesn't really have a good plan for having a bunch of creatures in the bin. This probably works better in the reanimation version of the deck. Underrealm Lich was in the deck till the very end, but I don't really run a ton of extra card draw, so I didn't really have any way to exploit the Lich. It also costs 5 mana. I could still see a version of this deck that runs it, since it does provide a milled card every turn, which means your Coram gets more value. Gitrog Monster is probably bonkers in this deck, but it's bonkers in almost every deck, so unless the deck is purposefully designed around it, I don't think I really want to run it, but feel free to if you like it Froggy style. The mill that I want to run needs to be low cost and consistent. We want to get the biggie smalls into the graveyard, but also provide the most opportunity for Coram to play a land or cast a spell. I start with Ghoulcaller's Bell and Altar of the Brood. These are both really good in this deck. They're cheap, they'll cause mills for all your opponents, and you'll be able to get multiple triggers throughout the game. The earlier you get these out, the more value from Coram you will get. I run a package of constant mill creatures, and these all hit each opponent. Mindrack Harpy is probably the best of them, getting you 3 mills for all players every turn. That's a lot of Coram options for very little. Eye Collector will generally be pretty easy to get through for some damage and 1 mill. Tenured Oilcaster will mill whenever you attack or block, but note that the blocking mill won't get you any card advantage from Coram, as Coram's third ability only works on your turns. Sir Conrad the Grim will do something or other when something dies or doesn't die. I don't know, I'm not reading all that. The important thing is that it has a persistent table-wide mill for 2 mana, which ain't bad. Realmbreaker will only target 1 opponent, but you do get to steal land from their graveyard, which I think is pretty good. Whetstone is not a great value initially at 6 mana for the first mill of only 2, but it's not tapped when it's activated, so there's a chance for a big mill turn if you need it. Or if things go absolutely crazy, you may be able to mill a player out just through multiple activations. I finish off the mill with 2 1-mana value black cards, the first being Thieves' Guild Enforcer. You'll mill all opponents for 2, which is fine, but the real strength is that it has Flash and most likely Death Touch, so you can use it on your turn for a cheap mill, or during someone else's turn as kind of a makeshift Icefang Quaddle. The last card is Shared Trauma, and I'll be honest, I just want to see how many people I can convince to help out with this. This is a purely political skill testing card, and probably not very good unless you're planning to challenge yourself. I considered running Pestilent Cauldron since it could do double duty as a burying effect, but I just couldn't find enough consistent life gain to reliably get it to work. Altar of Dementia was considered as a way to potentially mill someone out with a 17 power Coram. It would have been probably better in the reanimate version of the deck since you could reliably bring Coram back and sacrifice him multiple times. One Ring to Rule Them All was also very close to being in the final version of this deck, since the second chapter would also function as a wipe that would leave Coram alive. But I don't like having to wait for my wipes. 4 mana is also a hefty price when you want to be casting a spell after you mill these cards. Cabal's Fury is a fling on a land, which is the greatest form of utility. Arcane Lighthouse is useful since you're going to do a lot of punching and that requires targeting. Dakmor Salvage is there as a free dredge option, though I don't think this deck really needs dredge, or really wants to dredge a ton, but I think 1 just in case is totally fine. I run 3 more utility lands that I kinda want to talk about a little bit, starting with Dust Bowl. I think at this point in EDH's life cycle, having some sort of non-basic land destruction in every deck is almost required. Lands are just too good these days. In fact, I think Dust Bowl is probably the least amount of land destruction that you should run. Echoing Deeps is really good in nearly every deck. The odds of hitting at least a fetch land in someone's graveyard is totally fine. Being able to hit your own cards, like say a Dust Bowl, is also really good. Or you could hit your own Shifting Woodland, which is probably a broken card. Jeez, this card, man. So this card doesn't exile a target, which means you can do it over and over again as needed on the same target. And also, the target you are copying doesn't come into play. It's just there. I don't know, maybe it's not broken. I'm just always wary of cards circumventing entering the battlefield. Also, this is another card that lets you cheat phage the Untouchable into play. Do with that what you will. Bonder's Enclave could be ran here if you want another card draw, though I don't think you really need it. Bojuka Bog could be another option here for some graveyard control, though I'm leery of removing an entire graveyard. Granted, you can just not use it the turn you plan on using Coram's ability, so maybe this isn't that bad. You could also run Boseiju Who Endures because you have green in your color identity, so there is literally no drawback, and this card is useful in literally every game, regardless of what deck you're running. Oh man. I run 3 lands that provide Jund colors, and 7 dual lands for each guild. I finish off the deck with 3 forests, 1 mountain, and 1 swamp. I think this deck is probably best in the mid-game. Blowing your wad way too early means you need to win right then and there, and I prefer decks where you don't go for a win right away. I think probably I just want the table to do some of the work and not just rely on your own stuff. Let those bastards fight it out for a bit and then punch them in the face for 16. I would get a bit wary of ramping and getting Coram out turn 3. Coram needs a bit of setup to work, so maybe don't bring it out until you have a way to get a giant into your graveyard at least. You don't want to send Coram out there not flamed on. And there are some weaknesses to this deck, and that's mostly because you rely a lot on Coram. Removal in response to fights is bad. Same for any kind of instant graveyard removal, but you can play around with that by keeping big creatures in your hand and using your instant speed burial cards. Keep a giant in your hand, discard it with Survival of the Fittest. If you're a bit scared of removal, you can also run something that gives instant speed hexproof, something like Snakeskin Veil. And I have a lot of cards like Snakeskin Veil in my Agent Frank Horgan deck that I did a video on, so if you need more ideas along those lines, you can go ahead and take a look at that video here. Otherwise, thank you for watching Element Hobbies. If you liked the video, feel free to subscribe, and I will see you around.